Hi, welcome back. This is Unit 2 of the Book Lab, and it's basically about the outline. As you'll recall from the last unit, I'm trying to structure these units so that they follow along in the basic collaborative process that I highly recommend. So Unit 1 was about the idea. It was about the broad strokes of coming up with the basic idea of the story that you want to tell and really thinking about your lead character's wants and goals and needs and conflict and all of that sort of thing. This unit is called the outline because I'm a real stickler for the idea of using an outline. Now, not all playwrights use outlines, and that's fine, but I find, generally speaking, with a musical, the whole story is so complex and the whole process is so collaborative that without an outline, you can really find yourself in a lot of trouble partway through the process and find that you've done a great deal of work and committed a lot of time and effort and made a big old mess that is really hard to clean up. That's not to say that an outline will completely make sure that that doesn't happen. I wish that were true. But it can certainly minimize some of the issues because it's easier to see logical flaws, character flaws, plot inconsistencies, storytelling issues in a 5 or 10 or even 20-page outline than it is to identify them in a 120-page first draft of a completed musical. Not to mention the fact that it's an awful lot easier to fix those flaws when you're still in the outline form than it is later when you've written a bunch of songs that you love. Now, I do have a separate outlining lab where I have 6 units that are all about the 6 steps that I recommend for creating an outline, and that lab goes into a lot of detail and leads you through the process. What you're going to get right now is a sort of a crash course in outlining because this is only 1 unit in the book lab. If you're really interested in this topic and really want to do some more work, I would recommend you consider taking the outlining lab later. Right now, though, I'm just going to encapsulate the concept of outlining and really try to underline the fact that I think it is of vital importance not to begin writing your musical until you have an outline that is rock solid. The outline will act as a blueprint for your entire musical. It's a place for the team to rally round. The whole collaborative team can look at that outline and can understand the story they're trying to tell. Everybody knows what the story is that they're trying to tell. They can really hone in on the specifics and ask those questions about wants and needs and goals and conflict and all of that sort of thing. So please, please, please do start with an outline. Now, there are a million different ways to do an outline. I have a recommended process of 6 steps to lead you through the process of creating an outline. It's sort of the same idea as the 6 units in this course, I guess. The idea is that rather than facing an entire outline, which can feel daunting, instead you take it piece by piece and build up and start from the general and work toward the specific. It can be a little easier to get you where you're going. That being said, let me just talk to you about the 6 steps that I recommend for an outline and lead you through them in a crash course. The first step is what I call the 3-phrase beginning, middle, end. Now, this is really on the broadest of broad strokes level. It's very much about theme. What you want to do is literally just write 3 phrases, not sentences, phrases. One that represents the beginning of your show, one that represents the middle, and one that represents the end. Another way to think about this is to remember the mantra that a musical is about someone who wants something, what they do to get it, and whether they get it or not. Those phrases are roughly equivalent to the beginning, the middle, and the end. In the beginning, you have a character who wants something. In the middle, you have a character who's doing a bunch of things to try and get what they want. And in the end, you have a character who either gets what they want or doesn't. So when you write your 3-phrase beginning, middle, end, that's what you can be thinking about. And I really, really mean phrase, not sentence, not paragraph, not page, really a phrase, even just a few words. Because again, at this point, you should be thinking broad strokes. You should be thinking thematically, conceptually, metaphorically, not plot-driven. This shouldn't be about plot, this happens, this happens, this happens. It should be about theme. You should be thinking about the unwavering want as opposed to the specific temporary goals, because you'll get to those later. If you were going to be doing a 3-phrase beginning, middle, end for something like 110 in the Shade, the musical version of The Rainmaker, you might say that the beginning phrase is drought or dryness. The middle is possibilities, fantasies maybe, and the end is rain or completion. Or, it can be as simple as that, just broad strokes. If you were to try to concentrate a little bit more on Lizzie's story as opposed to the overall story, your beginning, middle, end, your beginning might be withdrawn, and your middle might be beginning to open up, and your ending might be fully blossoming. That may sound really simplistic at this point, and it's always going to seem that simplistic if you take an existing piece and then try to back up and create the three-phrase beginning, middle, end for it, because it seems like, well, yeah, duh. But when you don't have your story yet, creating those three-phrase beginning, middle, ends can help you begin to shape your story. And I would recommend that you write a whole bunch of them, so that both of the ones that I mentioned just now for 110 in the Shade would be very useful if you were trying to come up with that story. So in other words, what you do is, let's see, I want to tell a story about a woman who finds herself, so I think the beginning of the story, I want her to be really shy, and then in the middle of the story, I want something to come along that sort of, awakens her soul and gets her thinking, and then at the end, I want her to blossom as a woman. And then that might lead you to a story like 110 in the Shade, because you've figured out for yourself those big broad stroke moments that you want for the beginning, the middle, and the end. Now, I would really recommend that you keep those phrases big and general, but that you write a whole lot of them, for the overall story, for individual characters. You can explore different story arcs, character arcs, story structures for your piece. You can explore different ways of doing it. So that's the three-phrase beginning, middle, end. Now, the second step in the outlining process is the premise. Now, the premise in my mind, my definition, and by the way, let me just throw this in here. I use a lot of words in this lab, and I give a lot of definitions, and other people will have different definitions for the same words. The words that I use and the definitions that I give are for the purposes of this course, so that we can understand each other and be on the same page. They're not the only way these words can be defined, and they're not the only way these topics can be discussed. They're just what I'm using for now for this course. So when I use the term premise for an outline, what I'm talking about is one paragraph that, again, is going to cover basically the beginning, the middle, and the end of your story. So it could be one sentence that encapsulates the beginning of your story, one sentence that encapsulates the middle of your story, and one sentence for the end of your story. And again, these are roughly equivalent to what does your lead want, what do they do to get it, and do they get it or not? Same idea. For the premise, you can, if it's useful to you, add a couple of additional sentences. You can add a sentence at the beginning that gives a little bit of backstory and setup if you need that. This is the story of a woman who, blah, 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 followed by your sentences for the beginning, middle, end, and then you might want one final sentence that sums things up, maybe sums up the story arc for your lead character. But 5 sentences would be a maximum for the premise, and they shouldn't be run-on sentences. And this is where you could start to bring in the plot as well as the theme. So really what you're doing for this step is taking the three-phrase beginning, middle, ends that you did in step 1 and lengthening them a little bit, turning them into sentences, bringing in a little bit of the plot, broadening their scope. And where your three-phrase beginning, middle, end was meant to be thematic and conceptual, as I said, this can be more plot-oriented. You're expanding from 3 phrases to 3 to 5 sentences that make up a paragraph. So your idea is growing. It's getting a little clearer. Now, you still could, at this stage of the game, write more than one premise for your story. You could explore several different possibilities, especially if you're not sure what your story is going to be, and so you haven't made all of your decisions yet. This is a great time to experiment and say, yeah, I don't really know whether I want her to marry him or not. Well, write one premise where she does and one where she doesn't. This is the time to be doing that kind of exploring, because you don't want to write a musical and then go, oh, I wish I hadn't had her marry him. I don't like that. Explore that at this stage while it's still only a paragraph, so that you can make the decisions now before you start the real hard work of writing the entire musical. Okay, moving on. The next step in the outline is the swill outline. And swill, yes indeed, means garbage. What that means is that the next thing you want to do is just sort of blah all of your thoughts down on the page about, well, this could happen, that could happen. Spelling doesn't count. It's almost stream of consciousness. Don't lift your pen up from the paper, just write and write and write. Probably for not much more than about an hour. Just try to get out everything and all the possibilities. Maybe she should marry him, maybe she shouldn't, I'm not sure. Somehow or other I want to get her here, but I'm not sure how I'm going to do that. It's all garbage. It's not meant for anybody's eyes. It's probably not even your collaborators. It's just your way of thinking about all of this and getting it written down so you can start to work through some of the story possibilities. That is the swill outline. Now, before I go on with the other steps, let me just mention one other thing. You are a book writer. So that means you like to write. You like the words, the way that words play with each other. You like the way they sound. You like putting words into characters' mouths. You like the sounds that words make together, and I really understand that, and I really appreciate that. I am a lover of what book writers can do with their words. An outline is not that. An outline is not beautiful words. It's not writing that you can be really proud of. It's utilitarian. It serves a purpose. But it is not what's going to finally be in your book. So this is a tough stage to get through, because what you really want to be doing is writing some great characters and some great scenes, and you're not doing that, so it seems boring. Don't worry about it. It can be tough to be in this stage, doing this sort of non-writing, this utilitarian, boring writing, but it will stand you in such good stead in the long run. Trust me on that. Stick with it. You will get to write all your beautiful writings later on that people will get to see. But it will be richer and fuller and more wonderful because of the time and effort and thought you put in beforehand. So stick with it. So we've done the three-phrase beginning, middle, end, the premise, the swill outline. Next comes the rough outline. The difference between the swill and the rough outline is that now you're going to start making some decisions. You're going to start breaking it down into scenes, maybe even acts, so don't worry about that too much yet. But probably you're going to say, in scene 1, this is going to happen. In scene 2, this is going to happen. You're really starting to get the basics of the story down. There could still be some questions, still some spots where you're not sure, but the rough draft of the outline is one that you might want to share with your collaborators. Get their input, see if they like the way things are going, if they have any suggestions about what might work better. But you're starting to refine it now, at the same time as putting in more detail. So it's getting longer and more specific. Then, step number 5 is the outline itself. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I'm just going to tell you quickly that step number 6 is revising the outline, and that step can go on forever because you can rewrite it to please yourself, to please your collaborators, to please your dramaturg. And this is the tough part, because you want to keep working on it until it is the best that it can be as a blueprint for writing your show. As tough as this period is, believe me, it's worth it. It's going to save you so much trouble. It is so much easier to change your mind about a big plot point like does she marry him or not when it's a 20-page outline. You don't want to have to do that after you've written a whole draft and you're going to have to throw out all the songs in Act 2 because you changed your mind. And now, you know, you can't avoid that altogether, those kinds of changes, but you can minimize it if you really spend a lot of time in the outline. So that being said, let me go back a little bit. I jumped over step 5 sort of purposefully because, of course, step 5 is the heart and the soul of the whole thing, the outline itself. You could say that it's just a further clarification of the rough outline where you no longer have any questions, you just state what's going to happen. But I get a little more detailed about it. Let me put it this way. The language of the outline is really important. And again, it's not beautiful prose, it's not poetry, it's not gorgeous writing, but it is very purposeful. The outline should simply be a step-by-step explanation of the action of the piece. It should only talk about what your audience can actually see and hear, although you're not going to put any dialogue in the outline. Let me see if I can be clear about this. You don't want to talk about the mood, you know, like it's a rainy day and you can feel the wind coming around the corner and a man drags himself down the street. You don't want to use adjectives, you don't want to use beautiful poetic phrases, because it's not about that. You simply want to state who is in the scene and what do they do. Simple as that. Here's the key. Don't try to tell your audience, who for now is the person reading your outline, what they're supposed to be feeling or how they're supposed to react. Don't put that in the outline. Because the whole point of the outline is to say, okay, here's what's actually going to happen. Now let's go back and look at this and say, if this is what's going to happen, then how will it make the audience react? Will they react the way I want them to? Will they get what I'm trying to say? So you don't want to use phrases like, we can see that she's angry, or the audience understands that he really wishes that she would come home with him. How will they understand that? Don't make assumptions about how your audience is going to think. Just say, you know, he looks longingly after her as she leaves. Then step back and ask yourself the question, is that action going to accomplish what you want your audience to feel? Okay, also don't put in backstory, don't put in explanation, just put in action and see whether or not the action of the plot tells your story. Simply put, you don't want your outline to say Joe is angry. That is useless language in an outline. What you want your outline to say is Joe hurls a chair against the wall. The difference being, if the audience sees a man hurling a chair against the wall, they're going to say, whoa, he's angry. So they draw that conclusion. If you just write in your outline, Joe is angry, then when it comes time for you to write the actual scene, you're going to find yourself going, okay, Joe's angry. How do I write that? What does that look like? What's going to happen? And then you still have all these decisions to make because you haven't actually created a blueprint for yourself. Now, you might be at this point, you'll be saying, yeah, I'll come up with those decisions as I go along. And yes, you will. You'll say, oh, I know, he'll throw a chair against the wall. You'll come up with it while you're writing the scene. But there are about 1 million different actions you could come up with for that moment, and each one of them is going to have different ramifications down the road that are going to impact on other decisions you've made and eventually change everything. So you won't really have done the job of the outline if you haven't already decided what that action is and therefore already accounted for the ramifications of that action in the rest of the plot. Because the fact that he hurls that chair against the wall could come back later and mean something. When it turns out it was his grandmother's chair that he broke and now she's really angry with him or whatever. There will be ramifications. So those are exactly the kinds of decisions you need to be making during the outlining process. Therefore, language in an outline is really important. You only want to talk about where the scene is, who's in it, what do they do and say. Only what the audience can see and hear. And only with utilitarian prose. No backstory, no exposition, no trying to tell me, your audience, what I'm supposed to be feeling or thinking, or for that matter, even telling me what the character is thinking, because I won't know that. Put yourself in the position of an audience member who's watching the scene. What is the action they are going to see and hear? Not what are they going to think or feel. It seems simple, but it can be really difficult to do. In the handouts for this particular unit, there's one handout that lists the 6 steps that I've just talked about, and it gives you short definitions of what each of the 6 steps are. And there's another handout that talks about useful language, and it shows a couple of examples of language that I think is not useful. In fact, you'll get this in your handout, but let me just read one of them so you'll see what I mean. So here's an example of what I would consider to be non-useful language in an outline. Inside a jail cell, O.J. has been arrested for 2 murders, and he sits alone in a jail cell. His fame has gotten him nothing. He's a common criminal. He's famous, more famous than he could have dared. Everyone knows his name, but for the wrong reasons. What has happened? He wants to talk to Nicole. He thinks he sees her right here in his jail cell. He's going to explain, tell her everything, and just as quickly, he's alone. Now, near the end of that, I think it starts to get a little bit better. That could be action-oriented, but all this other stuff about how he's been arrested for 2 murders and his fame got him nothing and he's more famous than he could have dared, that is all backstory. That's all stuff, okay, maybe he's thinking that, but actually it's backstory. It's not what the audience is going to see. They're going to see a man sitting in a jail cell. They're not going to know all of that unless, of course, he turns to the audience and says, why am I here? Okay, now, of course, it's a musical, and he might indeed turn to the audience and sing, why am I here? But I would posit that that isn't very active or very interesting, and that you're going to back yourself into a corner where you're just going to have your characters just singing their thoughts at the audience. But there isn't any really interesting action or conflict going on. So I don't think that's useful. Here's another example of non-useful language. The first 2 gay cavemen accidentally discover farming. Instead of expending energy running and hunting, killing, skinning, and butchering like their neighbors, the crazy, inventive Brinkley and pragmatic Hunter realize they can simply watch food grow, allowing development of the world's first potbelly. They set aside their continual bickering and celebrate. Okay, so first of all, accidentally discover farming? There's no explanation here what that means. What are we going to be looking at as an audience as we watch 2 cavemen accidentally discover farming? This isn't useful as a blueprint because it isn't telling you what's going to happen. It's a very broad concept. Some of this language would work just fine in a premise, but for the outline, what are they going to do in front of us as an audience? They're going to walk on and one of them's going to pick up a shovel and say, oh, look, farming. I think you need a little more than that to make it clear what's actually going to happen. It also says they realize they can simply watch food grow. Okay, well that's something. They're realizing something. They could be talking about that, but again, that's sort of talking heads. It's not really action. Allowing development of the world's first potbelly. This one is really tricky because that's something that's going to happen later, getting the potbelly. You know, it's going to take, you know, a few weeks anyway, and I would assume they're not going to stand there saying, oh, if we stand and watch this grow, I guess our bellies will get fat and we'll have potbellies. It is in fact a funny idea for the show to get to eventually, but in that moment, in that scene, those two people aren't going to be aware that they're about to have potbellies. So that's not when this particular joke would happen in this show. So it shouldn't be in the outline. Anyway, the outline isn't a place for funny jokes. That might be okay in a pitch or a premise, but in the outline, we want to know the action that's actually going to happen in the scene. So it isn't useful in the outline to talk about it because it's not going to be relevant to that scene. Now, here's one that's an example of useful language in an outline. Scene 1, Paris in the 1950s, a deserted street at dusk. A little boy comes in chasing his ball that rolled away. A strange man accompanied by a woman picks up the ball and returns it. He asks after the child's mother. Suddenly, the woman grabs the child. The man knocks out the child with a blow to the head and is about to slit his throat. The woman stops him, thinking she hears someone coming. They drag the child away. Now, granted, that's a little colorful, but look at the language of that. It's very sparse. There's no explanation in there. Things happen. We see action, and we're full of questions as an audience. We're full of, why is that happening? Why is he doing that? Oh my goodness. But all you can think about is, oh, I want to know what's going to happen next, because this stuff just happened, and clearly there's a reason, and I don't really know what it is yet, but I want to know, so I'm absolutely going to want to see what the next scene is. I am not going to be leaving this show until I find out what's going on. But there's no explanation there. There isn't backstory. There isn't talking about what might happen in the future or what their motives are. It simply describes the action that we see happening in front of us very clearly. And of course, the writer certainly knows what the reasons are behind all of this. It's not like the person writing that outline doesn't know why these characters are doing these things. But this scene is not the moment at which the audience will know. So that's why it's not in the outline. That's the big difference. As the writer, you do indeed need to know why, but you also need to know when you're going to tell that information. We'll talk about that probably more in the next unit when I start talking about exposition, because you need to know what all the facts are, but you also need to decide when you're going to let the audience know what those facts are, when you're going to give them the information they need to figure it out on their own. So suffice to say that I'm pretty particular about the language used in an outline. And I think if you really want an outline to be useful to you, then you need to really train yourself in this kind of outline writing. And then when you've completed an outline using this kind of useful language, you will truly have a blueprint for your story that will allow you to simply sit down and write the scenes just as you outlined them, by just filling in the dialogue and accomplishing the outline. Because you know everything that's going to happen. You've made all of the decisions and figured out their ramifications at the outline level. So you don't need to do that as you write your first draft. You just have to put the words into the mouths of the people to make that stuff happen. And then you get to really start having fun and doing what you really want to do as a book writer. Write beautiful language. But trust me, stick with your outline until it's rock solid. Make sure you're using this useful language that simply describes the action of the scene, and it will stand you in very good stead. Now, the one other thing that I want to cover in this unit before I let you go on to your outlines is character. Now, that may sound like an odd thing to skip to right now, but I know that right now I'm giving you all of this stuff to do that I've clearly said is not real writing. It's not the sort of thing that made you want to become a writer. It's not the sort of thing that you like. It's not the writing you want to show off. But eventually, it's going to come time to start writing some scenes and developing your characters. So one of the things that you need to do at the same time that you're developing your idea is develop your characters. So one of the assignments is to create a character worksheet that will help you come up with your own ideas for the kinds of things you want to know about a character in order to really be able to write that character and to figure out what that character is thinking and what their background is and what are their politics, religion, economic situation, all of that sort of thing. I'm not going to give you a worksheet. I'm going to ask you to write your own and then apply it to a character. And this will help you begin to collect the kind of information that you're going to need to make your character more colorful, more interesting, more specific, to find their language and their voice, so that in the next steps, when you actually get to start writing, you'll be developing characters that you're interested in writing. Now, I'm going to recommend, of course, that when you fill out your character worksheet, that you do it for a lead character, and that you really bear in mind what I keep harping on, that your character needs to want something. So when you're writing your worksheet, try to find some ways to ask yourself questions about your characters that will lead you to understand enough about them to know what it is that they really want, and the kinds of things that they would do to pursue it, and what they would do if they were in a position where they were faced with two goods or two evils. You really want to know a lot about your characters. You need all that backstory. It does not belong in the outline. And it doesn't ultimately belong in the script either, but it belongs in your head as you're developing the character. So that's why that's part of this unit. So once again, you've got your handouts to look at, you've got an exercise to do, an online test to take, and then a couple of assignments that will allow you to put into practice some of the principles I've been talking about in terms of outlining and character development. I do look forward to getting your assignments and to giving you some feedback on them, and then I will see you back here for Unit 3. Bye-bye.